Hi, my dear students. I'm Dr. Jeetu. Today's topic is dental calculus. It is a relatively simple topic, but there are some confusing things which you have to see carefully and keep with you. Going into the presentation, calculus is classified into two according to its relationship to the gingival margin, supragingival and subgingival. Supragingival also known as salivary and subgingival also known as ceremal calculus. Remember, it is based on its relationship to the gingival margin. So we'll go into the differences between supragingival and subgingival calculus. You know most of the differences. Anyway, supragingival, as we all know, is located coronal to the gingival margin and it is visible in the oral cavity. Subgingival is located below the crest of the marginal gingiva, therefore not visible on routine examination. Then color of supragingival calculus is white or whitish yellow in color. You can see in the figure it is white or whitish yellow. About its consistency, it is hard with clay-like consistency. That term is important. Clay-like consistency of supragingival calculus is clay-like, and it is relatively easy to detach from the tooth surface. As we all know, when we engage a sickle scaler or something and give a pull stroke, supragingival calculus is easily detachable. And do we see calculus only in white or yellowish white color? No, we can also see in brownish tinge and all that. This is because its color is influenced by external substances like tobacco and food pigments. So about subgingival calculus, it is evaluated by tactile perception. It is not visible on clinical examination, and its color is dark brown or greenish black in color. About consistency, it is hard, dense and flint-like. Supragingival was clay-like. This is flint-like. Flint is a hard stone. It is composition of silica or quartz, composed of silica or quartz. So it is very hard. So it is flint-like in consistency and it is firmly attached and difficult to remove when compared to supragingival calculus. And this is derived from cerum, also known as ceremal calculus. Okay. Now, whether it be supragingival or subgingival calculus, it is visible on the radiograph. Because whatever is radio opaque is visible on the radiograph. But the sensitivity of detection is very low because after a particular level of calcification only, it is going to show on the radiograph. And the location of the calculus does not indicate the bottom of the periodontal pocket because the apical most plaque is never sufficiently calcified and it is never visible on the radiograph. Why is this happening? Because there is a continuous flow of GCF in the most apical part of a sulcus or pocket. So in this area, calculus formation is not complete. And one more numerical which is important is the distance from the apical extent of the calculus to the alveolar crest is a constant value, that is 1.97 millimeters. Clear? Calculus is predominantly inorganic, and the inorganic proportion of calculus we should learn. They can give this as pick the true or pick the false statement. Okay, this is very simple. The majority is calcium phosphate. What mineral is present in our tooth and our bone? The same calcium phosphate accounts for 76%. And remembering the others are easy. Calcium carbonate, CaCO3, it ends with a 3, so it has 3%. Magnesium phosphate, Mg3PO4, it is 4%. And carbon dioxide CO2, 2% it constitutes. Easy, no? And there are traces of other elements like sodium, zinc, strontium, bromine, copper, manganese, tungsten, even gold is present in calculus. So again, pick the true or pick the false statement if they give and you see these elements, you may get confused. Is gold present in calculus? You may feel yes, it is present. Aluminium, silicon, iron and fluoride, many trace elements are present. Another thing is at least 2/3 of this inorganic component is present in a crystalline structure, and there are 4 main crystal structures: hydroxyapatite, magnesium whitlockite, octacalcium phosphate and brucite. Again, the bulk of the crystalline form is hydroxyapatite. The hydroxyapatite which is present in our bone and our tooth, same hydroxyapatite accounts for 58%. Magnesium whitlockite accounts for 21%, and octacalcium phosphate reverse it to 1, you reverse it to 1 to 12%, and the least is brucite which accounts for 9%. And there are some MCQs associated with each of these crystal forms. Hydroxyapatite, yes, it accounts for the maximum percent. Hydroxyapatite and octacalcium phosphate are the most frequently detected crystalline forms. About brucite, it is common in the mandibular anterior region. Mandibular anterior lingual is a very frequent area of calculus formation, you know. The bulk of this is formed by brucite. About magnesium whitlockite, this is the major crystal form found in the posterior part of the dentition. So there is one point regarding all the 4 crystalline forms. Okay. Another important question is the difference in composition of the subgingival and the supragingival calculus. About the hydroxyapatite content, it is the same. Supragingival and subgingival has the same amount of hydroxyapatite. And we will learn the features of subgingival calculus. It has more of magnesium bitlocate, more of magnesium. And the other two crystal forms are lesser. Bruchite and octacalcium phosphate are lesser in subgingival calculus. One more thing, subgingival calculus is more hard and it has more of calcium. So the ratio of calcium phosphate is higher in subgingival calculus. Also one more thing is, as the depth of the periodontal pocket increases, the sodium content increases, whether it be supragingival or subgingival calculus. Why this difference is happening? Because its derivation is different. Supra is from saliva and sub is from serum or GCF. That is why there is a difference in the mineral content. Now there are four modes of attachment. How calculus is attaching to the tooth surface. The first point is by organic pellicle. Pellicle acts as the intermediate. Second point is mechanical locking into the surface irregularity like resorption lacunae and caries. Look at the figure, it is marked as 2. So there is a resorption lacunae or some caries on the cemental surface into which the calculus interlocks. Third point is its opposite. Here mounds of cemental surface can be seen. Onto these mounds or elevations, the adaptation of calculus under surface depressions happen, and that is how they attach. And the fourth mechanism is penetration of calculus bacteria into cementum. Directly the calculus bacteria embeds into cementum. So when this embedment is deep, this calculus appears morphologically similar to the cementum. Therefore, this entity is known as calculocementum. Now, as we all know, plaque calcifies to form calculus. So, the calcifying plaque becomes 50% mineralized in 2 days. Just in 2 days, half of it is mineralized, and the remaining 60 to 90% takes 12 days to mineralize. This numerical is important. 50% mineralized in 2 days and 60 to 90% mineralized in 12 days. One more thing is, plaque has the ability to concentrate calcium some 2 to 20 times its level in saliva. That is why it has a calculus forming tendency. And we know there are heavy calculus formers and light calculus formers. It is genetically determined. Okay. So this heavy calculus formers has more calcium and 3 times more phosphorus and less potassium when compared to the non-calculus formers. So from the concentration itself, we can find that phosphorus is the more critical element because they have 3 times more phosphorus when compared to light calculus formers. Again, about bacteria, the filamentous bacteria increases when plaque converts to calculus, and the foci of calcification changes from basophilic to eosinophilic. Staining property changes from basophilic to eosinophilic. One more thing about the pattern of mineralization of plaque. Usually, plaque means it is a group of bacteria. So, mineralization of plaque usually starts extracellularly from outside the bacterial cell, whether it be gram-positive or gram-negative. But sometimes it can start intracellularly also from inside the cell of the bacteria. This calcification can happen. So, which are the organisms that can form this intracellular apatite crystals? They are some filamentous organisms, diphtheroids, Bacterionema, and Veillonella. It is important. Filamentous organisms, diphtheroids, Bacterionema, and Veillonella species can form intracellular apatite crystals. Now the plaque keeps on calcifying and it forms a maximal level of calculus. What is the time taken for this? It is 10 weeks to 6 months. In about 6 months, there is a maximal level of calculus formed. After this maximal accumulation, what will happen? There is reversal phenomenon. Reversal phenomenon means the bulky calculus will start wearing off. It becomes vulnerable to this mechanical wearing off from any food material, from the cheek, lip, or tongue movement, because it has reached a maximum bulk and it can't stand as an entity, it just breaks off. This is called reversal phenomenon. Next important thing about calculus is the theories of mineralization of calculus. There are 4 theories proposed. The first one is called booster mechanism, physicochemical theory, or carbon dioxide theory. So, the theory says that calcification occurs when local pH and calcium phosphorus concentration are high enough to precipitate this calcium phosphate. So why this is called carbon dioxide theory? Because it is proposed that carbon dioxide is lost from a particular area and ammonium starts forming in that area. Because of this, pH increases or the site becomes alkaline. Whenever there is alkalinity, there is precipitation of calcium and phosphorus. That is how mineralization of calculus occurs. Second one is epitactic theory or seeding theory. This theory states that there is an initial seed or a nucleus formed, and this seeding agents can induce different foci of calcification that will slowly enlarge and coalesce and form a single calcified mass. So this small nuclei forms, this process is called nucleation. This nucleating molecules can be collagen or proteoglycans or any organic substances which will act as a seeding agent for the calcification. The third theory is transformation theory. According to this theory, some forms get transformed to form a crystalline calculus. So they say that the amorphous non-crystalline deposits and the bruchite, which accounts for very less percent of the calculus, they can get transformed to octacalcium phosphate and later to hydroxyapatite, and this transformation results in mineralization of calculus. And it is also suggested that pyrophosphate is a controlling agent for this transformation process. The last one is inhibition theory. Inhibition theory states that pyrophosphate is usually an inhibitor of calcification or calculus formation. So whenever there is inhibition of this pyrophosphate, that is an inhibition of an inhibiting agent. Therefore, calculus forms. And in relation to this, I will tell you one more thing. Fluoride has the potential to increase the plaque pH, and we already mentioned whenever there is increase in plaque pH, calcium phosphate precipitation occurs. Hence, it leads to remineralization of the heart tissues. One more very important point which you all know and I want to reinforce is calculus does not contribute directly to gingival inflammation. It is not the calculus that is causing gingival inflammation, but calculus act as a nidus for accumulation of bacterial plaque, and this bacterial plaque is the culprit to cause gingival inflammation. When we learn about calculus, we have to learn about the other dental deposits also. The first one is Materia alba. You can see in the figure. It is an accumulation of microorganisms, desquamated cells, leukocytes, salivary proteins, lipids with few or no food particles. That is important. Materia alba can contain food particles and it may not contain food particles also. And how we can differentiate this from plaque? It lacks the regular internal arrangement of a plaque. As we all know, plaque is a very organized colony of microorganisms. Okay, it is like a proper ecosystem, but this internal pattern is lacking in Materia alba. It is just a yellow or grayish white, soft and sticky deposit, somewhat less adherent than dental plaque. We know dental plaque is more tightly adherent to the tooth, but Materia alba is easily removable. We would have all seen this. If we miss brushing for some days, we can find this on our tooth accumulating. Fine. The next accumulation on tooth is dental stain. Dental stains are pigmented deposits on tooth surface, and as we all know, it is only an aesthetic problem. Stains are not going to cause any inflammation of gingiva, and mostly the culprits are tobacco products, coffee, tea, certain mouth rinse and pigments of food. The name of our chapter is calculus and other iatrogenic factors, right? So we'll see about iatrogenic factors now. Inadequate dental procedures contributing to deterioration of the periodontal tissue is called an iatrogenic factor. When the dentist performs some inadequate dental procedure and this leads to a deterioration of the periodontium, this is called a iatrogenic factor. Overhanging margin of dental restoration is an iatrogenic factor. And how is it causing periodontal disease? Because one is this overhanging margin of the restoration changes the ecologic balance of the sulcus area, and this favors the growth of disease causing organisms. The second one is very simple. The patient's access to remove accumulated plaque is inhibited because of this overhanging restoration. Subgingival margins typically will have 20 to 40 micrometers gap between margin of restoration and unprepared tooth. So how much ever we are trying to do it properly, this 20 to 40 micrometer gap is present between the margin, unprepared tooth margin and the restoration. Another factor is excessive luting cement. So, as we all know, when you lute a crown, whether it be on a natural tooth or on a implant, if you use excessive luting cement, it will lead to inflammation. So, peri-implantitis is frequently associated with excessive luting cement usage. Another one is over-contoured crowns and restorations. Again, this will accumulate plaque and this will handicap the oral hygiene measures. Another important iatrogenic factor is food impaction. This concept is important. Food impaction is the forceful wedging of food into the periodontium by the occlusal forces. So first of all, it is a forceful and active process, and the occlusal forces are the culprit. So there will be a cusp that will forcibly wedge this food into the interproximal embrasure, and these cusps are known as plunger cusps. Now, why I am emphasizing so much? Because there is another term called food lodgement. Food lodgement, unlike food impaction, is a passive process. Food impaction was so intentional, okay, forcefully the cusp is pushing this food into the space. But food lodgement is a passive process due to your masticatory forces, your lips, your tongue, your cheek, everything moves. Because of this, the food passively moves and get lodged into a space, and this is called food lodgement. Clear with the difference? So the scientist who did most studies on food impaction is Hirschfeld. He recognized 5 etiologic factors. The first one is uneven occlusal wear. When the occlusal level of 2 teeth are different, definitely it can lead to food impaction. Second one is loss of proximal support. Very simple to understand. No proximal support, food goes into the space. Third one is extrusion of a tooth. Again, the occlusal levels are uneven. Congenital abnormalities in morphology of a tooth can lead to food impaction. And finally, improperly constructed restoration. One more situation that can cause food impaction is excessive anterior overbite. That means there is an excessive overlap of the maxillary anteriors over the mandibular anteriors. So what will happen? Food impaction happens in the lingual surface of maxillary anteriors as well as on the facial surface of mandibular anteriors. When you imagine that excessive anterior overbite, you can easily picturize food impaction happening in these areas. Finally, it is not just your improper techniques that will cause iatrogenic damage. Not doing what is warranted is also doing damage. For example, there is a missing mandibular first molar, and replacement of this first mandibular molar will cause a sequel of events. This is very important. So in this figure, you can see a missing molar. A treatment possibility of an implant is depicted there. You can ignore that. Okay, so when the first molar, mandibular molar is missing, the first thing that will happen is mesial drifting of the mandibular second and third molars. You know the tendency of mandibular molars is to tilt mesially. And the maxillary first molar, definitely it is not having an opposing tooth, therefore it happens the extrusion of the maxillary first molar. Later, what will happen? The mandibular second molar had tipped mesially. Therefore, its distal cusp will extrude and it will act as a plunger cusp. And this plunger cusp will open the contact of maxillary second molar distally so that food impaction will occur between first and second maxillary molar. Yes, so there was a missing mandibular first molar. It ended up in creating food impaction in between maxillary first and second molars. Clear with that? So when you are asked a question, unreplaced missing first mandibular molar will cause food impaction between maxillary first and second molars. So this is the final slide. I wanted to show this to you because I had got confused seeing this figure. This is from Karanza. Seeing the first figure, I thought it is some kind of aspirin burn. This is actually toothbrush trauma. The overzealous use of a toothbrush resulting in denudation of the gingival epithelium and exposure of the connective tissue resulting in a painful ulcer. So just a toothbrush trauma is depicted in figure 1. You can see gingival recession as a result of toothbrush trauma and the ulcers. The second figure is actually a chemical burn caused by aspirin. So how do you identify? It will show whitish sloughing gingival tissue. So aspirin burn is going to cause a gingival slough. Recession is also present, but that is common. Due to toothbrush trauma also, due to aspirin burn also, you can get a gingival recession. So now you know all the concepts. Now you can attempt doing your MCQs. When you are clear with the concepts, you can extend your thinking to right or left, and then you can get all the answers. That is what I believe. While hearing some topics, we'll be pretty sure this is going to confuse us. So be clear with those things and repeatedly revise those things. If you have any doubt regarding this, you can definitely text me or you can ask me. Thank you.